Well, welcome to Masters with Masters. I'm Ed Hoffman, NASA's Chief Knowledge Officer. We're here at the Glenn Research Center. I want to thank Martin Forkosh, our Glenn Research Center Chief Knowledge Officer, and Kathleen Clark from Human Capital for setting this up, and the folks at Glenn Research Center. We do these to get together with distinguished practitioners who have a lot of expertise and experience working and leading many of the NASA programs over the years. And today we're very fortunate to have both Susan Motil and Carol Ginty with us. And I'll start with Carol. Carol started at NASA when it was the Lewis Research Center, and I remember that, in 1982 as an aerospace engineer. She did research on fracture and failure mechanisms in polymer matrix composites, has written over 30 publications documenting the research and the work that she's done in her career, and has spent over 26 years of experience managing research and development and flight projects for NASA. She's currently the project manager for the Evolvable Cryogenics projects as part of the Space Technology Program Office. So thank you for being here, Carol. We also have Susan Motil, who is the Deputy Chief of the European Services Module Integration Office for Orion Program. Susan's also been at the Glenn Research Center for 26 years now, and in her current role provides the integration and interface with ESA, the European Space Agency, to ensure integration of the service module, a propulsion system for Orion's multi-purpose crew vehicle developed by Lockheed Martin. I've known both Carol and Susan for a good long period of time. And it's a pleasure to do this. Let me start, I guess, with Carol. How did you get to this point in your career? What brought you to NASA? What got you involved in research? And how did we get to this point?
We all have our different stories. Mine's probably a little bit unique. I graduated with a civil engineering degree, and I never thought of working for NASA with that degree. Although I was 10 years old when the moon landing occurred, and I remember looking out at the moon and thinking how cool all of that was. And I'm a self-proclaimed Trekkie, so science fiction is a very exciting part of what motivates me. But NASA at that time, we had flown shuttle in 1981. The Apollo program was basically being closed down, and the agency was looking for some fresh blood. There was that bimodal age distribution, pretty much what we're dealing with right now. And so my advisor at my university was actually contacted by a division chief here asking, were there any young people that you would recommend for a job here? And he thought of me. And it was that quick. I was in here for an interview, and I was the first woman hired in the structures division here at the center. And so I was part of the research organization at that time, which was fairly large at the center. And I did research for 10 years, but there was also a protocol that basically said you would not be considered a serious researcher or get promoted unless you had your PhD. I got my master's degree while I was here working on the research, but quite frankly, I didn't like the technology enough to pursue my PhD. And I was always asking, researchers tend to look down and focus narrowly on a topic, and I kept popping my head up, and I had a yearning for the big picture. And so in 1990, there was a program called High Temperature Engine Materials Program, and it was to start doing more of a development of that technology. And so I got my first experience as a sub-project manager. I guess today we would be calling them like a level 3 manager. And I just knew this is what I was meant to do. And so I continued to move up projects in aeronautics. And after about 25 years, I decided that space was getting very exciting with Orion. And so I made the transition over and started managing space projects. Sue and I have worked together on a few of those, and we'll probably have some anecdotes to share about that.
Yeah, and like I said, I've known you, so I keep thinking of all these different questions, which we'll get to.
Okay.
And so one of the things I think of is it was good to be part of that fresh blood
Yes, it was.
Now it's,
And it was
it's
a little
wisdom
bit,
now.
it was a little bit lonely for a while. There
Yeah.
weren't very many young people, but the agency did a mass hiring in March of 1983. And at this center, 300 fresh outs showed up. And it was a really fun time. I mean, we became family for each other, and there are still people from that group that are lifelong friends.
Yeah.
So it was very exciting to be part of that.
And so Susan, same thing. You came in about the same time frame. Now you're in this cool position. How did your career evolve? How did you get to? Did you always know you wanted to be at NASA and what you're doing? How did that shape out?
So no, like Carol, I grew up during the space age. My dad worked at NASA, so I had a lot of influence there. But being a young person and being stubborn and all of that, and the rebellious teenage years, I didn't want to have anything to do with engineering or anything, because that just wasn't cool, because my dad was an engineer. But I quickly found out going through school that my passion really was math and science. So I led myself through school, going through the math and science program, and graduated from Cleveland State University with industrial engineering degree. I had no visions of working at NASA initially, and my dad actually told me I was working out in private industry at the time, and my dad had said, hey, they're hiring. It was the wave of new hires that was coming in. I was a little later
the
than
second
83.
wave.
It was the second wave in 1989. So when I came into that wave, I got hired in. I started out in the systems analysis group for Space Station Freedom. At the time, the Glenn Research Center had the electrical power system. We were considered work package 4. And similar to Carol, I had this yearning for the big picture. And I remember being a very junior engineer, working away on analysis, but I had no idea where it was going, but I had that interest in knowing where it was going. Sitting in a meeting with Ron Thomas, who was the director of the Work Package 4 effort, and he was making all these decisions. He was getting input from everybody, and I sat in that chair and said, I want to be that man. So I actually started my career with that goal in mind then, knowing that, wow, it just seemed exciting to me. Knowing the big picture, I know there's a lot of responsibility to it, but I wasn't afraid of the responsibility. I wanted to be the person that influenced those decisions. So when I started, and then I went to microgravity, and I started doing space flight projects that were payloads on the shuttle, I was hooked, absolutely hooked. I started with these very, very small payloads that you can get your arms around. There were only maybe 3 or 4 people working them at a time, and I was the project manager for this. I did ground testing. I did all the work associated with space flight. I had engineers helping, with analysis and testing and things like that, but all of that paperwork that goes along with the flight experiment, because the staff was so small, it was me and my project scientists that just continued to get the work done. We did all the training, crew training. We did all of the acceptance testing. We handed the payload over. We did all the operations. And at the end of my first flight experiment, the principal investigator came up to me, shook my hand, thanked me for a wonderful job and for the data that he had. And from that point on, I said, wow, what a reward. There's no other reward for me than the person that I was doing work for coming to me telling me what a great job we did to get that off the ground. And then I started looking at projects with higher complexity,
Right.
bigger projects, and I just continued to go down that path and looking for opportunities to manage space flight projects.
Yeah, both of you have talked about coming in, obviously understanding about the space and Apollo, but open to where things go, and then career starting typically with specific work, and then that decision of, do you stay or do you go larger in that impact? And one of the things we were talking about before this was that you're a couple of the folks that when the agency was setting up the project management policy, which people won't remember, before there was, Susan and Carol were involved in that group that were saying, we don't like kind of where things are going. So you always had different opportunities.
And we didn't know each other in that in
Okay,
that session.
in that
We
course.
And we
sat
didn't
in-
even know that for years later
No.
when we worked and we talked about it. And there was this voice in one corner saying, that's not going to work for space experiments. And I was the aeronautics rep saying, 7120, the way they were writing it, is not going to work for aeronautics. And so we had never crossed paths and didn't for probably
many years.
years after that.
We
yeah.
sat in opposite corners of that room, and we found out with the first project that we worked on together, the Space Environmental Test Project out at Plumbrook, we found out
Yeah.
that we were on that panel together. It's like, oh, and I go, I was there.
Yeah.
No, I was there. So that was kind of a fun learning experience.
Yeah, it's a key thing too, because a lot of folks, in terms of colleagues that we grew up with, is no one can really say this is how I got here, but typically folks like this, they've been involved in, that was a special activity. We brought people together from across the agency, and at the time no one knows how does this connect, but it connects to different things. I want to come back. So one of the things, obviously, at NASA we focused on the last number of years is this thing of knowledge. Because how do you, at the end of the day, whether it's science, engineering, projects, or procurement, it's having expertise, talented people, and how did they learn, and how does that that continue throughout the community. One of the things interesting about you, Carol, which is different than most in terms of projects and executive positions at NASA, is that you've documented a lot as part of your work. You've published over 30 articles as part of your research. How did you have the discipline to start doing that? Because there's usually a pull of, I want to do the project, but I don't want to take time to reflect and think. So was that part of just who you were, or did you feel that that was necessary?
Okay,
to be
both,
successful?
actually. That's a good question. Obviously, a little bit was selfish, because if you were a researcher at any of the 3 research centers at that time, there was a little degree of publish or perish a little bit, right? If you're doing work, you have to have evidence of that. So to some degree, publishing was a way of being recognized internally, and obviously it was the kind of things that your managers were looking for promotions. But beyond that, I was doing research before the internet. So there was no Google to find out what everybody else was doing in the area. So I felt an obligation to publish what we were learning, to share that with other NASA centers who were just starting to work with composites in their individual programs, and with industry. Because we were in aeronautics, and aeronautics really doesn't build anything. It develops technology. And so we set up relationships with all of the engine companies to try to, it was really us pushing out our technology, because they were busy and trying to meet deadlines, and they had bottom lines to meet as well. And so that relationship of really transferring our technology was, again, became a passion for me that I have carried now through all of my projects. So I had mentioned the high temp project. We were doing a lot of work at this center in all types of composites, and nobody really knew about it. And because the pace was so fast, we don't often have times on projects to stop and publish until everything is done. And so what we started doing was holding a technology transfer workshop. It was a conference that we held one time actually in this room every year. And what we did was just highlight all the work that we had done for the year, so we could push that out in some format to industry and universities who were, further developing the technology. And in our projects, we continue to do that with industry. Because of budgets, it's often difficult to interact with industry in a contractual mode. And so we, on our last 2 flight projects, we established industry workshops where we meet with them to give them the opportunity. And again, I believe as a federal agency, that is our obligation, to turn all of our knowledge out back to the people who funded it.
Right, and it's beneficial, you're saying, but individually,
Yes.
because it highlights, it probably also fine-tunes, obviously your
Right.
thinking of what works, but it's also a way to communicate what Glenn is doing, what aeronautics is doing, and to exchange that with
Right.
colleagues as part of a community.
And you try to influence, right? But
Right.
the cycles are different. In aeronautics at that time, it took on average 12 to 16 years for a new idea that was developed, like at a NASA center, to make its way into an engine. And a lot of us aren't in our roles long enough to get the gratification that you did with your principal investigator. So I think, for us, If I look at our body of work that we did here on the high temp project, much of the GE90 engine has a lot of that technology. So you don't get, if you're in it for immediate gratification, you're going to be left hungry a lot, right?
On everything
on
NASA
that.
builds.
But unless you
builds,
publish or take the steps to get it out there, it's just going to sit on individuals' desktops or in documents someplace gathering dust. And to me, that's a travesty. So
And then
again,
the networking, people see your name, so
Yes.
they can, let me
and that's
let me
and
talk to
that we'll
Carol
get into
about
that about establishing relationships and building a community for yourself that you will use often.
And I know, Susan, you've been, and I think probably the first time that I saw you was related to some work we had done with Ask Academy Sharing Knowledge, and you had found a solution that Marty Davis, who was a project manager at Goddard, and you went over, you talked to the Goddard folks, and you brought that back, and so you've always obviously been aware of the importance of the sharing. How in terms of, I guess, in your career, do you go about seeing these are the things that I've learned and capturing that and making sure you're keeping that, but also making sure that it's getting out there, particularly in your role with now you're working with Europeans and with industry and with others. How do you approach, what Carol's been talking about?
So, like Carol, I mean, it's important from a project perspective as well to get your, your word out, your documentation out, and that a lot of that is publishing for conference papers on the work that you're doing, because there are so many people interested, typically, in what you're building. The last project that we were on was a cryogenic demonstration, flight demonstrator. And there were so many people in industry that were very, very interested in that technology and how to get that technology out into the forefront and into their hands so that they can develop commercially, these cryogenic flight vehicles. So, we spent a lot of time networking in conferences, documenting through published papers. We had workshops. We brought in customers of those types of technologies together and to try to understand what is it that your challenges are. And we would describe our challenges as well. And it was more of a knowledge sharing, because the community was so small, we would share the knowledge. I have a little anecdote for you on our Ask Magazine effort that we did. I wrote that article because I had talked to Marty Davis about design reviews. I was at the Orion CDR kickoff a few weeks ago, and a colleague of mine from Marshall Space Flight Center was at this review, and he tells me he read an article recently from Ask Magazine that I was in, and I said, really? That was at least 20 years ago. And he said, I didn't know that. I read it. And he said, and you talked about these design reviews, and I'm noticing that article that you wrote, I'm noticing people are implementing those design reviews exactly the way you wrote it. I was tickled pink, actually, when I read it. It was really amazing to hear him talk about how design reviews have evolved and are changing, and I'm sure people don't do it exactly the same way, but they get ideas, right? And they foster an idea, and they grow that idea, and they implement them in their own way.
Yeah. Well, they also see that it's one of the things, and we spend a lot of time over the last certainly 30 years at NASA talking about creating an environment where people can share in the importance of it. Because we've seen, certainly, I've seen managers and I've seen teams that, everything's behind a wall and don't let that, center know about it. And obviously, your careers are very different, but it's good to know also that something that you kind of wrote 20 years ago that people see that and they come back. So it travels. Related to the issue of learning, one of the things we talked, and there were sessions here yesterday, Glenn, on culture. And the importance of having a culture where people are open, they can exchange, they can talk about things. And it seems as a follow-on to the issues of knowledge and capture and all that. And I guess here I'll start with you, Susan. In the work you do, which is obviously largely it's about integration, and it's probably about systems that involve not only NASA, Glenn, but NASA, European Space Agency partners, and Lockheed Martin and others. How do you go about creating a culture that's open and that's sharing and that's positive, where there could be a lot of tensions and competitions? How do you do that?
So certainly there's a lot of tension. The partnership, and that's exactly what it is, a partnership. It's not a contractual arrangement. So you have to use a lot of negotiation in your dealings with the Europeans and their contractors as well. For me, it's all about relationships and building those relationships. And if you can, walk the talk, if you make a promise to deliver something and you deliver, then you build credibility with your partners. And it is about, especially coming in new to an area, it is about building those relationships and demonstrating credibility on our side. And we do have a large effort in where we're open with our technical team and driving our technical team to deliver on their promises too. We have open forums where our 4 parties are together, NASA, Lockheed Martin, ESA, and Airbus, where we can talk about, the issues. We have, our own NASA Lockheed forums where we're open about progress. You have to have a method and forums that people feel comfortable in bringing issues to you. And oftentimes there are people are different, right? So there are some people that are okay within an open forum to speaking their mind. But many times there are people out there that have an idea, maybe they're afraid to share it in that open forum, or maybe they haven't really formulated that idea yet, but they want to get it to you and they didn't do it in that open forum. That's okay.
Right.
I've always left it open for people to give, send me an email. If you don't have a response today, send me an email, pick up the phone, call me one-on-one, and we'll get it addressed. You have to have your open door, and you have to provide people opportunities in many different forums to get their voice heard. I have an example of something that had happened on a previous project where it was struggling a little bit. We were trying to set the course right on, set them right on it. Face-to-face meetings are really important. Carol was on that same project. We did face-to-face meetings many, many times on this particular project, and it was at a different center. And the headquarters had gotten wind that this project was, struggling a little bit, and they wanted to cancel that section of the project. Let's, in an effort to reduce budget, let's get rid of this part. We had spent so much time developing relationships with this other center, meeting with management, meeting with the technical team, that when it came to that moment, one of the senior managers at this center had come to us and said, I will take the arrows for the issues that this project is having, and I said no. I said, I'm the project manager. I will take responsibility. I'm taking the arrows. I will shield you from the arrows. That, in and of itself, was a game changer in
It was
building
for our
trust.
project and moving forward. It was
Well,
a
it
whole
changed the whole
different
relationship,
demeanor
yeah.
of the entire project. Yes. And I guess, any kind of sharing, right, to me is predicated upon trust. And so to some degree, it is responsible for us to build those relationships. I don't think we can stress enough how much relationship building up front is needed. And it's hard. We're all sitting in conference rooms talking to polycoms, right? You can have people on from 5 different centers. Most of our projects have been cross centers for the last 15 years. And we've had projects that have gone with multiple primes and international partners. And so we believe that, that face-to-face upfront, finding the travel dollars, arguing for the travel dollars, getting that immediate personal connection first does seem to change the nature of the work moving forward.
So do you build in times where you go to meet with your different partners, or the
Yes.
partners come
Yes.
together,
Yes.
and because there's always pressures
Yes.
in terms of, do you really need to
Yes.
travel? Do you need to do that? But
Yes,
you
you
can't
need to
replace.
travel.
I think it's imperative.
Right.
And
I
you
mean,
need to
that
travel when
face-to-face.
things are going well. You don't want to
Right.
establish the relationship of just showing up when there's problems or issues, because then you get the, oh, here
Here
they
they
come
come.
again, right? So, no, traveling is, and just meeting is really, really important.
You don't want people to feel like they're coming to the principal's office every time you
Exactly.
show up, right? You
Yeah.
want them to know that when you come, you're there for the good news as
Right.
well as the bad, but you're also there to support them.
Right. We're the project
You know?
managers across many centers, and I want them to know that I've got their back as much as the people that I get to see every day at my own center.
It's the trust thing that you come
Right.
back to. Other ways, Carol, from the standpoint of how do you build that kind of an open culture? We spend so much time at NAS wherever we're at about culture.
Right.
And how difficult it is. It always
Right.
comes up.
And I
So-
think it actually is, it takes a while, and it does become personal on with both parties, right? We may have put ourselves out there and said, we do have an open door, but nobody really trusts it until they see what happens with it, right? And then one-on-one over time, you start building that relationship. And then I think, the news spreads that, they are trustworthy. They do say, or they do what they say they're going to do, and there's no repercussions. Another thing is, you talked about publishing and sharing knowledge.
Right.
I think it's just human nature. And then professionally, nobody wants to talk about their mistakes, right? So there's not a lot of publishing on, oh boy, did I step in it this time, right? Or this didn't work for a lot of reasons. So one of the things we've done, with building our networks is if we were going to try something new, we call them TIMs. They're technical interchange meetings. Could be at a site that's off-center. You bring a few people together to do just bouncing ideas off and say, this is what we were thinking about. And then in that environment of trust, you'll have somebody say, don't do that. We tried it, it doesn't work. But again, nobody's going to publish that for a lot of reasons.
Right.
And so we have found those, the meetings of the TIMs like that to be very, very helpful for us in formulating a project and going down a certain path, or when we're having some difficulties that our internal team can't necessarily come up with a solution. And that's sometimes the outreach that we will do with industry as well to try to help us develop a solution to that.
Right, yeah, no, it all comes together. I was struck by, because we had a case study earlier today that Ed Rogers was facilitating, where one of the questions, or I guess one of the discussions was the importance of you have to have different ways that people can raise concerns,
Right.
issues, or ideas, because some people are comfortable, they want to be able to say at the moment, hey, this is what I see. Others, want to come back later, or they want to do it in a different kind of a mode. So that's kind of what you're talking about. The difficulty of mistakes, which every project, you don't get through a week. How do you deal with that? Particularly, we're talking about the fact that there's a new wave of young professionals coming on board. I think it's even toughest, right? Earlier in the career. How do you create it so that it's safe to say, hey, we think didn't go right here, or there's a mistake, and it's okay to talk about it? Is there anything special either of you do to make
Well,
that
I think,
work?
you have a team. You're meeting with them at least weekly on a team meeting. I mean, that's usually been my cadence with the projects. You're meeting with some of your management, your lower level managers several times a week. I think if you demonstrate that, I'll come in and say, my bad.
Right.
I did something I probably shouldn't have done, right? You talk about it, we triage it, we mitigate it, and then they see that, again, you're kind of setting an example that it's okay. I always believe that my managers expected of me to give them a heads up, right?
Right.
You don't want a manager walking in any place and finding out something for the first time in a meeting. And I want that of my team too. I want to know
No
what's happening.
surprises.
No surprise,
Yeah.
right. That is part of our value system is I want to know so that we can help mitigate it before it becomes a problem. Because often it is not that bad. It just takes on a life of its own as it goes through the grapevine. And so the faster we can shut down something like that, the better it is for all of us, because we just don't have a lot of time to work the little things that become issues and then end up in, your boss's office. We try to avoid that.
A lot of people try to work the issue themselves. I see that a
Yeah,
lot on the European service module, where the people are working very hard at trying to resolve issues. and it's getting them to raise those issues to our level early enough that the schedule's not impacted, cost is not impacted, that we can start working the issue at a management level, because with the Europeans, there's a lot more of that management interaction than you do at the technical level, because they respond better at the management level, and they have their own contract, and so they're managing, cost and schedule, and so those agreements usually have to come at the management level anyway between the partners. So a lot of people try to really work it hard at their own level, and it churns, and so it's about bringing it up. So we've tried to do things on making sure that all the issues are visible to every single team member, that they can see what we're doing in trying to mitigate these risks. And sometimes you get somebody that's not even involved in that and saying, hey, I've had that happen to me on a different project. Have you tried this? So it's a lot of times, sharing occurs within the team when you're open and you're honest about how things are going.
Yeah, it's what you do when things are good, so that it's not like a strange kind of thing. It's a double-edged sword, because we hired people and we select people for key positions because they're problem solvers. So at what point does, hey, I'm solving this problem and I don't need to take it to you become a problem? It's hard to sometimes see that.
Well, I think today, most of our projects are highly integrated. So there's not too much that one person is working on that isn't impacting somebody else on the project. I think that's just the nature of the work now. And so you want to give somebody time, because I'll say, I'm here to help you, and I mean that sincerely, not to, in quotes, help you, right? But you go off and you let me know when you need my help. And I think that's probably the best recipe now for getting resolution to some of our problems.
Yeah. Well, it's also an organization that's so technical.
Yes.
I've always said NASA works best when we have a problem.
Yes.
Because it's an engineering and science organization, and so that drives the innovation and issues. So we have some questions from our audience here, so when we get to those, because our time is going super fast. One of the questions, I guess, has to do with the impact of the internet on research. And so what is the impact of the internet on research? And I guess it applies to, obviously, the work that both of you do in terms of new technology, research. How does the internet change things?
Okay, so I'll take the research part. Maybe you can take the technology development. Yeah.
Okay.
So again, the agency's funding is very, very precious, and so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to not reinvent the wheel. And so obviously the first thing a researcher would do would a literature search on what is happening. Again, before the internet, you relied on libraries at most of our centers to go run that for us. But now you can Google it and find out what's being done. And I think it's really helped to identify where gaps still exist in technology. So if you want to make your mark and you want to contribute to the technology base, it's very easy to get to a place to find gaps now and to concentrate on that. So I really think it is an advantage for a researcher who really is starting off in a new area to define their niche and where they can contribute.
It's easier to find.
It happens much faster, right? Very quicker.
For flight projects, it's very similar, because a lot of times as you're developing the flight project, you come across your design, you say, gee, I wish I had a sensor for this, this phenomena here. I wonder if it exists. And the internet has exploded. I mean, it has made the ability to get information so much faster than what it was when we first started. When we first started, we would cull through papers that the library would get you. From the standpoint now, all you got to do is do a Google search, sensor for this, and it comes up. And that's where you can find out whether there's an appropriate investment from a technology perspective on your flight project. Because flight projects don't necessarily want to use technology on the flight mission itself, because its technology readiness level is not high enough.
The pedigree isn't there.
The pedigree isn't there. But if there is something that's pretty darn close, and your schedule permits it to come in at preliminary design, then you're willing to advocate for that technology and maybe put some money towards that technology to boost it up because it's important for your mission.
It's easy to find
so
vendors
It's very
now.
easy
Right.
to find.
It has
Yeah.
helped on schedules
So
for procurements.
And not only
It's
that
been-
way, it's easy for people to find you.
To find us.
Right.
And they do.
Which is, again, both good and probably sometimes difficult. Speed has changed everything.
Yes.
There's a question here from someone who says, as a young professional, sometimes you feel you're not being heard, and you can feel, not as engaged. How did you get the confidence to speak up? And it appears to me both, as long as I've known you, you've always had confidence, but that probably it's. So how did you get the confidence to, basically say this is important, or raise the questions, or challenge something?
So I gave it a try.
And they didn't kill you.
And they didn't kill
yeah,
me.
right,
I mean, so I always ask the question, what's the worst thing that can happen,
Right.
right? If the answer is no, so what?
Yeah.
Then the answer is no. But if you never ever try to get your voice heard, then you'll never know what the reaction is. And so with each try, you gain confidence in yourself because, gee, I guess I did read that right. When somebody says, good question, I didn't think about that, because you're thinking that person knows everything, right? And here you are, you bring it as a young person, oh my goodness, you bring so much perspective and difference of thought into the workplace that it's refreshing. So we can get caught in ruts a little bit. Well, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. And then that young person comes in, outside box, right? Outside thinking, and then you get this idea and you sit back and you go, never thought of that, but that's a good question, let's pursue it. So whenever, I just tried. And,
Yeah.
and maybe it's my makeup, but if you're afraid to
part
do
of
it.
leadership is.
Yeah,
you
it's
raise
funny,
it.
I never saw myself as that. Like for the first 5 years here, and we shared offices with Motil. I had 3 office mates, so there's
Right.
4 of us working. And I remember we didn't even have computers on our desks. We were still doing, programming on the big IBM machines, and we're all
Right.
talking, and they're talking about a training, and somebody mentioned that there's assertiveness training course. And I'm just typing away and say, oh, that's a course I think I really need. And then it got very, very quiet in my office, and I looked up and I said, what? And they said, you need the course? You could teach the course. But it's funny how I never saw that in myself.
Right.
And so then that truly was an awareness that I had not embraced yet. And then getting involved in project manager, I was a deputy to a project manager, and he pretty much let me deal with the tough issues. I don't know if that was by design
Probably.
or just by, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Assertiveness.
But with each time, you build your confidence, right? I mean, you go in, you try to work the problem. For me, we were usually coming out with solutions. So it is a thing that you have to work on, and success builds upon it. But yeah, it's not being afraid to go in and have the tough conversations, right?
No, and like Carol, I never saw myself as a leader when I
Yeah.
first started. I just thought, well, I had a manager say, I want you to take this effort over, and I said, really? Why? He says, I think you can do it. And it made me nervous. And with each new challenge, it's okay to be nervous.
Yeah.
It's okay, nerves give you, it's that little devil in the background,
Right.
or the little angel in the background, right? Saying, you check yourself, because you don't want to be the smartest one in the room.
Right. Well,
You
it
know?
means that it's important. You
It
have
is.
that something means something. And obviously, key thing gets back a little bit to the mentoring, where people
Yeah.
gave you opportunities, and
Opportunities,
someone
yes.
saw something and said, you're good at what you do, and you go out there and doing that. One of the questions that comes up, what challenges have you faced or had to overcome being a woman at NASA, particularly at the early, so when you started, I remember those early classes, sometimes we would go to Wallops and we'd do that, there'd be like 30 in a room. and,
Sometimes today still you're the only,
You're the
I'm
only
on
woman in the
one of
room?
my projects, I'm often only the only woman in the room, which is unusual after, almost 33 years. But we were different. They weren't
were
used to us.
different.
I mean,
Was that difficult? Did that help in any ways, or it was just something you had to?
again, I didn't. I was my father raised us to be very productive. He gave us a work ethic. It had nothing to do with your background, your gender. He was a no excuse kind of person, and so that really didn't filter in to my everyday thinking. It probably wasn't until I actually was pregnant with my first child, and I was going to go on, and I was like one of the first ones because I was the first woman hired in that group, and there were no maternity policies. There was no Family and Medical Leave Act. I called personnel, and they had nothing to give us as an example. So again, my mentor was very, very work-life balance oriented for a man at that time. He really did pave the way for me. And at that time, the agency had said it was between you and your first-line supervisor. So I was blessed with a very forward-thinking first-line supervisor that then helped me manage that. And it really did change because we had women that were leaving the agency. Even though we had a daycare center here established to help with that, we had women that just left NASA because of the pool and maybe supervisors that weren't so willing to work with it. That has changed
But
significantly
there
now.
were women that trailblazed that path. You know, Carol was, you know, the first. I know I was the second one to get in our group anyway, to get the work at home part-time. One other lady had blazed that trail for me
now
before
that's
that.
taken for granted.
Oh,
now
yeah,
it's
but
taken
that-
for granted. But the supervisor, it was a challenge for the supervisor to agree to that, and all you had to do was show the benefit of doing it this way. That doesn't exist. And like Carol, I didn't have that in my makeup to be conscientious of being the only woman in the room.
Yeah.
I was the only woman in the room going through college, so
College,
why
yeah,
would that
wasn't
matter?
that different?
Being
Yeah.
the only woman in the room in the workplace. And I did have an instance, kind of like you in Epiphany, right? That I made a comment, amongst other people, that I don't really see any discrimination here. I don't face that. And somebody said, well, "Are you kidding? What about this and what about this? This happened to you the other day, and you don't think that that was discrimination?" And I went, all right, yeah, but I dealt with it, you know, and I didn't feel like I had to go running anywhere to a supervisor or anything like that just to say, hey, this happened. I wanted to work it myself, and I wanted to earn the respect, because it is all about earning, right? I mean, think about the environment where you're coming into a group of many men and very few women, and they have their own ideas about how things work, and you're new and you're different too, right? And if you come into that environment thinking, I am entitled, wrong. You don't come into an environment thinking you're entitled. You earn your respect. And I still believe that today, that you should not feel entitled to anything in this workplace. That's an ethic that I know both Carol and I have.
It also sounds like you're both fortunate that you had people who, in different cases, said, you know, I want you to lead this, I want you to move forward, take this issue, and you know, for the time we're supportive of that. Did you? I mean, you mentioned I guess you met first at the you know, the activity that we had in the course.
But we didn't know it.
Yeah, you didn't know it. There you go. Did you leverage each other at all, or not really?
No.
Not after
it
that.
wasn't
No, because
no.
we've worked in such diverse
Different,
mission directorates
Right.
and in different organizations here at the center. Our paths really didn't cross very much until we worked together
Right.
on our first project in 2009.
I heard about Carol. I knew about
So
Carol.
what did you hear about Carol?
She was a good project manager. She got things done.
Yeah.
And I needed some help.
Yeah.
And so I advocated for Carol to come over to my project, and she graciously agreed to come help me. And
Well, those are rhetorical questions. They're called directed reassignments. But again, that's another opportunity if you
Right.
take them, and I took them all. So,
Yeah, no, one of the themes that you certainly hit on is in terms of a career, and maybe it's true of all organizations, but certainly at NASA, which is project-based, your opportunities, you know, you come up. And so it's taking that, and then you meet
Right.
the different people and create that network.
Yep.
So it sounds like that's how you
pretty
approach
much
that.
what we've been doing.
And I can leverage Carol's networks, because we worked in different places, and she could leverage the people that I knew as well. Because if we didn't know, you know, we had a certain skill to fill, and we didn't know who, we would brainstorm that skill mix with names and see, well, we need a person kind of like this, and then we would go and work with the supervisors to try to, get that kind of skill mix onto the project.
So that leads to, I think, a fundamental point too that's missed often is that the primary definition of diversity, right, is people who don't think like you. So as a project manager, I try to surround myself with people who don't think like me. And so when Sue and I were brought together, our experience base was doubled because we had such different careers up till the point that we met. So when we had a problem solve, we had a very large plate to go into for solutions. I think there's some centralization that kind of goes on. Maybe it's the familiarity that tend to have projects staffed with people who have worked together in the past or have worked in the same organization. But I think that just surrounding your people who think differently than you and have had different experiences ultimately will help you have a successful project.
Yeah,
So
the
we've
whole notion of
we've tried to
cognitive
do that,
diversity,
yes.
which Schneider Buzek and others talk
Yes.
about, is people who think differently, see
Right.
different, approach it differently. I was going to, so you've talked in a lot of ways, we're going to be talking about mentoring coming up, but who has played a key role in your career, and do you look to support others now that you're in positions of influence and success? How do you approach the mentoring thing?
So I have a formal mentee this year, and I have mentored people in the past. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes informal.
Right.
People come in. I always said that our office was kind of like a confessional. People come in and go. I mean, and people feel like that they can come into the office and talk to us about issues and
About
problems.
anything,
So it's more than just having a formal
Yeah.
mentor-mentee relationship. I've had formal mentors in the past, but for me, the person that influenced me the most ever was my father. I mean, just my work ethic. He worked here. He helped me gain a name for myself, because I remember when he said there were people that would come to him and say, "Hey, I saw your daughter today," and he would say, "Who?" And they said, "I saw your daughter." I said, "Who?" "She has a name. Use it." And so that really helped. He said, "You have to make your own way. You have to earn your own, your own pathway." And I appreciated that, but I also could go to him a lot and say, "Hey, I have this issue." Or he understood the environment, the NASA environment a lot. And I had supervisors that were very good supervisors that I could go to and talk to in a less formal manner, and I had people, I don't know, for whatever reason, trust the work that I did. Maybe it's a proven track record that I had these opportunities. But I do have people that I can reach out to formally and informally, and I've been fortunate. I've been fortunate.
Obviously, you're good at what you do.
Yeah.
Just didn't get lucky. But what about
So
you,
my,
Carol?
my professional mentor here was Dr. Hugh Gray. That he's since retired, but he was the person who I first really did project management with and taught me all those things that were so different than being a researcher, right? Where you don't need, if they give you 15 minutes to give them an answer, you give them a 15-minute answer, as opposed to research where you would have weeks or months to, right, come up with an answer. He also was the one that helped me navigate through the work-life balance. I think at one time, he is the division chief. Most of the women were on part-time tours of duties. I was on one for 9 years as we tried to work through all of that. And it didn't hurt your career. I received a major promotion as a part-time employee, which again, if we were very isolated in these instances, and when people learned that, they were just shocked. But you were judged upon your resume and the work you did. Whether you were part-time or full-time was pretty much insignificant. So he really had a lot of influence on me
Key
with
person.
regard to that, yes.
And who do you mentor now?
So
or how
today, I'm near the end of my career, and I think I have a lot of knowledge to share. And so I have a relatively new project, and so I have gone out to the performing organizations and said, "Give me your young people." I have a young deputy. I have my CAMs in place. I'm looking for younger women now. and trying to do that mentorship and for succession planning, and also, again, to be an example, I guess, because it's still
Well, so you have
some
wisdom
hard
now.
to,
We were
to
joking
share.
about
Yes,
that coming
yes,
in, but I mean,
yes.
you have
We're
you have
seasoned.
answers. You're
Yeah.
seasoned.
Seasoned veterans,
You're
yeah.
the experts, I guess. There you go. So we're coming down to about the final 5 minutes. We've got tons of
Okay.
questions we haven't gotten to. So
Okay.
I'll probably ask if you have something you want to cover, I'll give you time, but let me go over a couple of these. So we had a session alluded to earlier where we had, I was going to say Chris Cleese was beamed in, but he was on a telephone. He was talking about decisions around the Discovery shuttle mission 121, and where there was disagreement with the administrator at the time and with engineering and with others. And the question goes, have you ever been involved in making an unpopular decision where you know it's not what people want and it's going against the grain, and from knowing
You
your
tell the
faces,
body
yeah,
language,
yeah.
yes, you go.
You go first.
No, you go.
No, you go first.
Well, I mean, CPST was
know.
underneath
Yeah.
you, so why don't you
Okay,
go ahead
so yes, we did make an unpopular decision. Multiple
and multiple,
unpopular.
with a lot of help from the agency.
There was a lot of pressure on the project itself to cut cost, right, for the flight demonstration. It was the cryogenic propellant storage and transfer mission, and it was we were under a lot of pressure to meet a schedule and to cut cost. And we were getting a lot of pressure from multiple areas within the agency, centers, to go space station, right? The technology itself would not have benefited the overall commercial community had we done it on space station. It was not large enough. It had to be a very, very large tank to do this, and you're not going to put a large tank of hydrogen on the space station. That was not going to meet the safety requirements. So we continued to pursue other avenues, and we did. We had an avenue to pursue, which was innovative.
Very exciting.
Very exciting. It was
Unprecedented.
Unprecedented. We went through to work with the commercial cargo office to get a contract with SpaceX for them to supply the
To
vehicle.
do a mission that they had never thought that they could do.
Right.
And we opened the
Right.
door to a possibility.
And they were
Very
very
excited.
interested in doing this. We did get a lot of pushback. The center was 100% behind it. You know, we sold this.
Right.
There were other areas of the agency that were not. I mean, they weren't as enamored as we were, because we were meeting the technology requirements, we were meeting the costs, and we were meeting the schedule. So we were like, it's a
can
win-win.
you? Yeah,
How
exactly.
can you lose,
That's
right?
Project Management 101, right?
But there were other forces, you know, and I understood those.
Right.
And as long as you understand those,
Right.
and you can respond to those, you know, find out, well, what is it that particular group, what are their concerns? And if you can address those concerns and get them to understand, you know, your position, it becomes win-win. We ended up win-win on that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to add anything.
No,
on-
just again, I mean, you're out there kind of, it's lonely place.
It's lonely.
Yeah.
You know, you're not getting a lot of air cover. And we got an inkling that SpaceX was interested. I had travel for you and chief engineer in the system, and you were there 2 days later. I mean, you have to move very, very quickly on things like this before, you know, the pushback starts. And
Right.
so we had already established momentum, and it was a win-win situation.
It ended up that way. It could have not. There was one other instance that it did
Yeah.
not end up that way, where we wanted to go a certain direction. It was unpopular, and we were directed to, no, you're not going to do it that way. You're going to do it another way. So I've been in
That's
that.
even,
I've been in that.
it's a different end, which is interesting. Where did you feel that being pushed to go in the other direction was, you could understand it, so support it, or was it?
I understood it. I could support it.
Okay.
The issue was getting your team
Behind
to
it.
Behind it.
So we wear a badge, and I think that's something we share in common from a, you know, an ethical point. We work at the behest of the agency.
Right.
So when the agency says they want to do it,
Then you go do it.
but then we had to develop a story that then we could share with the team to get them on board.
Right.
Right, and so working, so obviously you're involved in many unpopular, hopefully not mostly.
I don't
most
think
of
it's
the
us.
decisions
I
aren't.
think it's
just
just
in gen-
we
well,
have
it's
the
not just
opportunity.
us.
So as we come to the end, what would you like to advice for folks? A lot of things we didn't get into, like
Yeah.
innovation and risk. And
So, I mean,
all that. What's-
you know, from a career standpoint, I always tell the young people this because, you know, I had the opportunity to have hands-on experience.
And how do we define young people?
Oh,
no.
well, fresh out from college. Certainly
No.
not me, right? You know, so, you know, like Carol, I'm coming towards the end of my career. I'm not quite done, but you know, I'm getting there. But the people that are coming in, the new people that maybe are fresh out from college, because I had the experience, I think it's imperative as a smart buyer for the agency, right, that you get hands-on experience somewhere. And then there are places, there are pockets of the agency that you can get hands-on experience. The mission has changed somewhat. We do a lot of contract oversight. If you're going to be a contract oversight person, you have to have some level of expertise and background behind you before you can even do that. So my advice is to get hands-on experience.
It's doing it.
And
It's
do
the
it.
assignments.
Yes, it's the assignments. If you're interested in project management, position yourself. Try to look for leadership roles, you know, technical leadership roles, you know, work your way up. I also think rotational assignments can help, you know, especially with the way, you know, the agency is doing business these days, to get experience. If you can't get the hands-on in one location, start working in other
Yeah.
orgs so you can get that experience based on what those people experience. And I don't know if you want
Well, I think, again, we've had the opportunity, we laugh about the directed reassignments, right? I mean, I did a resume and I looked at this and I said, oh my gosh, it looks like this girl cannot hold a job, right? And somebody else, right, with diversity looks and says, I'd kill for your resume, right? But don't say no. I mean, you're leaving your comfort zone many times, but I've learned so much on every new assignment. And who thought, almost 25 years after I graduated, we're on a project at Plumbrook developing test facilities for Orion, and I am pouring concrete and laying rebar. I mean, whoever thought it would come full circle? So we've had very diverse careers, and I think a lot of it is simply because we didn't say no. Every time someone gave us an opportunity, you know, we took it. And it's hard. I mean, it takes a long time to transition into a new team. Learn a new technology, right? Establish yourself in a new project with new centers. But it's exciting for me, and I call it the action in the trenches. I love all the action that occurs in the trenches.
Don't be afraid to stretch your wings,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you get stuck in a niche role, you know, you have to be willing to come out of that niche and get out of your comfort zone, like Carol said. There are going to be areas in your career where you're not going to be comfortable.
Yeah.
But if you can weather that, it's just another notch of experience in there, right? So I would recommend, if you feel like you need to do something different, go do something different. Get out of your organization if you need to go do that something different. All it does is give you experience.
And
Well, the
don't take it
richness-
so seriously.
The richness of a project is that there's always a different assignment, so we've
Right.
talked about the importance of assignments,
Yeah.
of taking risks, of having good mentors, of sharing. And at the core, what you haven't said, but that's always come through with both of you, is you both have a passion
Oh,
for anything
yeah.
you're doing, a
Yeah.
very, very positive
I'll take
passion.
passion. Any day.
right?
Absolutely.
Right.
So let's thank Susan and Carol. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's gone
Thank you
real
for having
fast.
us.
And
Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank
It's
you
fun.
for joining us.